Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. As you know, Lyme disease is something very important to me, and May is Lyme Awareness Month to discuss recent what's going on with the politics of Lyme. We are talking today with Beth Pfieffer. She's been a journalist for 4 decades, and her new book, Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change, has just been released. Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
I want to thank you for writing this book. I think it's been a while since we've had something as thorough as what you've written. And, even in reading your book over, it seems like a lot hasn't even changed. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But thank you so much for bringing this the awareness to this issue.
It's my delight to expose this, really, because this is a situation that needs investigative reporting. And I like to say, the first investigative reporter without chronic Lyme disease, totally an outsider to do this sort of expose.
Well, as a survivor of Lyme disease, reading your book was... I was enthralled. I actually couldn't put it down. I spent a whole day just reading it this weekend. I encourage anybody, even if you're not affected by Lyme, just that what you bring forward in the book is really important for us all to know, because even if we haven't been infected or affected, or a family hasn't been affected, it's going to be in the upcoming years.
Well, that really was my goal, to write a book that would be accessible and readable for most people who aren't scientists. I'm not a scientist. I had to wade through a lot of science. But what I did was translate that science and the politics and the patient stories into a narrative, into a book that I think is readable. As you say, people have told me they can't put it down, which you don't really say for a nonfiction book on a very prevalent disease. But yes, my goal is to bring it to the general public, not just to people in Lyme support groups who know the danger of ticks. Other people have to know that these 8-legged creatures, which I call disgusting, are out there, and there's lots of them, and they're moving around.
Well, I got very itchy when I was reading your book, and I was inside. But there's something when you're explaining everything that just, even though I thought I knew everything, it turns out I didn't. And I think one of the things that really got me was that the infected ticks are more likely to find the prey than the uninfected ticks.
Yes, isn't that amazing? They had more body fat, they found in a scientific experiment. They lived longer. Infected ticks do very well out in the wild. And that's just one aspect of this whole picture of how this Lyme disease pathogen has managed to evolve over millions of years, literally, and is able to live not only in a cold tick, but in a warm-blooded mammal, and in between to survive in the tick, when it hides under the snow, when it's hibernating, and so forth. And beyond that, it has amazing capabilities to survive in the human body, to hide from antibiotics, to lay low under things we call biofilms, which basically are a matrix of cells that protect them when they are being attacked by antibiotics. And I guess we'll get into a little bit more about the treatments. But yes, you're right. This is an amazingly adaptive and talented organism that we are fighting today.
The more I learn about Lyme, when there's new things like the infected ticks can find us because they have the Lyme infection, it baffles me that we're in so much denial. And I guess we'll get to that later. But this is such a intelligent infection. And when I was first diagnosed and started reading about it, I realized how much smarter it is than we are, because we're dying from it, and we're in complete denial that it's even there.
Yes, and there is good research being done to try and figure out how the Lyme spirochete, it's called a spirochete, which is basically a corkscrew-shaped, single-celled bacterium, and we're trying to figure out how it evades our immune system, how it gets past all these sort of gatekeepers that normally keep bacterium down, fight them off, and enable us also to fight them off after we've been infected and develop antibodies. But through tests of mice, for example, we learn of ways that the pathogen can really get around, can actually disguise itself, can sort of wear a different coat, so it's not recognized by our immune system. And that's really great research. There's a researcher out at UC Davis in California who's doing a lot of that by the name of Nicole Baumgarth. But the overall problem is we haven't spent enough money to research Lyme disease. It came around around the same time as the HIV virus was identified. 2 years apart, they were both identified. But Lyme disease has been long considered, for way too long, as sort of as a nuisance disease, relatively easy to diagnose and treat. And I found in my research that it is nothing of the kind. It is not easy to diagnose, not easy to treat.
Okay, well, so let's talk about it first. For anybody who isn't aware of Lyme disease, although thank goodness there's way more press and people are more aware, just to exactly, what is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a bacterial infection. It's delivered by the bite of a tick. It's usually the black-legged tick. Has different species of black-legged ticks around the world, and in fact, there's the taiga tick and there's the castor bean tick in Europe and in China that are infecting many people. They're cousins to the black-legged ticks that we have here in the U.S. and in Canada, and when they emerge from an egg, one adult will lay 2,000 eggs. They're basically clean. They don't have the infection. They take their first blood meal, usually from a mouse that is infected with Lyme disease. Then they turn into juveniles, the second of the three stages. The last is the adult. But for human beings, the juvenile stage is the most dangerous, because that's when that little tick climbs up a blade of grass. We walk by and brush up against it. It climbs up our leg, and it is so very small, like the end of a sentence, a period, that we usually don't see it. And we don't feel it either, because when it bites us, just like the pathogen itself, the tick has a lot of incredible talents. It basically numbs the little part of our skin where it bites us, so we don't feel it. It has the ability to stop our blood at that site from coagulating, because that would otherwise stop the blood from flowing into the tick. So it does these things. It bites us. It falls off maybe after 48 hours. That's, they basically say 24 to 48 hours is what it takes to transmit the disease, though some people argue it's much sooner. And then, in a couple of weeks, you may get a rash or you may not. And you're the lucky one if you get the rash, because then you have a very clear indicator that you are infected. That rash is like a positive test. It tells the doctor, if the doctor is informed enough, and sometimes they're not, but if the doctor's informed and you present with that rash, whether you know you were bitten or not, you should be treated. There are a lot of pitfalls, though, to this picture of diagnosis. And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about that. But as far as the bite goes, it's often very surreptitious. And that's really the dangerous part of this. We don't get treated early. We don't see it.
So is a tick bite the only way that we can get Lyme?
Well, there are some theories out there. But again, the science is not conclusive because not enough science has been done to show that it is possible that it is transmitted from an infected mother to her baby in utero. There have indeed been case reports of that, and there have been babies who have died as fetuses, fetuses who have died in utero, in which they have found the spirochete in the fetus. But this is not something that is generally accepted in the medical literature. There's still a great deal of debate about congenital Lyme disease. There's some suggestion it's sexually transmitted. Again, very, very little data to support that and accept it in the medical literature. Some people have said there have been some scientists who have said that it is transmitted by other vectors like a mosquito, but I remain very much unconvinced.
Well, I think as someone who treats Lyme, I think it's either that it is sexually transmitted and passed in utero, or we have an epidemic, or both. Because when you're treating a whole family infected with Lyme, it can't be as rare as they're saying.
Well, it's surely not rare. And yes, there are. I have interviewed parents who themselves, one or the other of the parent, usually the mother, will have Lyme disease, and many of the children have it as well. There seems to be, and this is another thing we need to look into, some sort of sensitivity to it in terms of maybe genetics, in terms of our immune systems. Some people are hit much harder than other people. But the numbers certainly suggest epidemic is the word for this. I mean, in the U.S., we had 36,000 cases in 2016. You multiply that by 10 because there is an undercounting of the disease that is acknowledged by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, that for every one case that is reported, there's probably 10 more. It is very widespread. It is very prevalent. The risky places are where it's emerging, even riskier than here. I mean, it's certainly a problem here in the U.S. where I am. Insofar as doctors, at least in my area of New York State, knowing it's here, but it's also spreading to Canada, spreading widely in Canada, spreading in the UK, spreading in Russia, and Turkey. I get a lot of inquiries from patients in Turkey. And in these places where the doctors haven't been alerted to a great enough degree of the hazards of letting an infection fester, of waiting to test, of waiting to treat. These are the problematic places, even more so than where it is thoroughly entrenched, like where I live in New York State in the Hudson Valley.
Well, one thing I know that happens, I'm in Canada, and there is studies showing that there are infected ticks in my area, but there's a response from the medical community that's not just them saying, oh, it's pretty rare that you couldn't have that. They actually say they don't believe in it.
That disheartens me. I think what they're saying is they don't believe it's there where you live. Is that the case, or they
No.
certainly have to believe in the disease?
No, they say I don't believe in Lyme. It's not a thing. Yeah.
Oh my.
So it's
Well,
it's not here, so you couldn't have it, excluding, they don't even look at travel history. And I hear this almost every day. So it is disheartening. And there's a bit of a backlash in, I think, all of Canada, from what I gather, that this is not something that we even need to consider.
Well, yes, there is that belief. It's not here. I'm not going to bother to look, which is part of the reason why the case reports stay low, because doctors may not believe that it's in their area, that there are infected ticks. And another of the reasons, besides that they don't look for it, the numbers are low, is that there is something called the surveillance definition for Lyme disease. And in Canada, I believe it's almost identical to what it is in the United States. And that means that someone has to present with a Lyme disease rash, or they must test positive on the two-tier test. And the two-tier test is the test that has been validated and licensed by the U.S. Federal Drug Administration. It's the one that's endorsed by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and it's pretty much the one that's used in most industrialized nations where you have Lyme disease. And it's very difficult to test positive for Lyme disease at certain stages of the disease. Very early in the disease. Go ahead.
I want to go into that, but we have to take a quick break, so we'll talk about it when we come back. We're talking today with Mary Beth Pfieffer, and we're discussing her book, Lyme, and we'll be back shortly.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
The largest syndicated alternative health talk program has come to the Voice America Network. The Dr. Bob Martin Show is the program that will answer your health questions and help you to heal your own body of many different ailments. Each week, you'll hear the answers that Dr. Bob gives to his callers that help them to be their own doctor most of the time. We'll also discuss developments on the healthcare front and what you need to do to keep your body in top form. The Dr. Bob Martin Show airs Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
The Voice America Live Events channel is here now to showcase your corporate, individual, or organization's live event. Visit voiceamerica.com/live events to see all of our past live events and find out more. Whether it's a multi-day conference, special speaker, or single-day event, we've got everything to make your event a success. We can do a few hours or a few days. For more information about taking your event to the next level, call Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or email info@voiceamerica.com. Again, that's Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or send us an email to info@voiceamerica.com. Voice America is where you are and where you want to be. Join us around the globe as we broadcast live from some of the most interesting events available. Don't forget to view all our live events, including on-demand access to past events that you may have missed by visiting voiceamerica.com/live events.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Mary Beth Pfieffer, and we're discussing her book, Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change. So, Mary Beth, before the break, we got into a little bit about how Lyme disease is tested, and I think that's really important to talk about. So can you just explain that to us, what's going on there?
We have relied on the same technology to diagnose Lyme disease as we have since 1995. And there has been discussion for many years and scientific studies as well. to the effect that this test misses many cases of Lyme disease. It's well acknowledged that in the first 2 to 4 weeks of infection, perhaps 30 to 40% of people will correctly test positive. So the majority of people who are positive will not test positive on this test. So if you don't have the rash, but you do have symptoms, it's tick season, the doctor may say, let's wait a while, let's retest. Later on, there is little doubt that the test does get better, but it's not until what they call the late disseminated stage that it is at its best performance. And then you may have 90 to 100% accuracy in terms of correct positives. But still, it misses some cases even then, in particular, a form of Lyme disease that manifests itself as neurological. Lyme has neurological symptoms. So, we basically have known that this test fails at different stages of the disease, and that the overall premise of it is to wait. We'll test later. And that in and of itself is a very dangerous concept, because that allows the spirochete to move throughout the body. It is known to quickly leave the bloodstream, and subsequent tests then may not be able to pick it up because it has left the bloodstream. It hides in joints. It can go to the heart. It can cause Lyme carditis. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. So we've known for a long time we need a new test. A task force is actually meeting in Washington, D.C. They put out their first subcommittee report just last week. They said we need to retire this test. We need a new test. And just getting back to reports of Lyme disease in Canada and elsewhere, if they rely on this test to count cases of Lyme disease, we know that there are many, many more cases of Lyme disease among people who don't meet this very high threshold of testing positive.
So, we know that people are being missed and they're not being test positive. My experience in Canada, of course, any testing done outside of Canada gets ignored, and our test is not very accurate. And when people get a positive test, they're told it's a false positive, and then nothing happens either.
That is another key flaw of the test. The test does not tell a physician whether if you're positive, whether it's a current infection or a past infection. That is a huge problem with a test that we use for diagnostic purposes. And we do have cases in which people are infected multiple times. You may not be infected just once in your life. You may be infected several times. So the doctor will look at that test result and say, I don't think you're sick. I don't think you have Lyme disease. Even though you have a positive test, I'm not going to treat you. And this, Rebecca, goes back to what you brought up before. Doctors, rejecting the idea of Lyme disease. They don't believe in it, quote unquote, which is absolutely ridiculous, because Lyme disease is a disease, and there's a wealth of scientific literature about it for sure. I mean, even the CDC and your health authorities recognize it. But what they are referring to, what they are likely influenced by, is the controversies that have swirled around Lyme disease for years. It has been maintained by the CDC and by a group called the Infectious Diseases Society of America, which is the medical organization that wrote the original and subsequent Lyme disease care guidelines that doctors follow. They maintain that a single course of antibiotics generally kills the pathogen in the human body. End of story. You don't have Lyme disease anymore. And that may indeed be the case for some people. And in fact, for many people who are treated early, they have a good outcome. The estimates are 80% go on to recover treated early, rash seen, doctor diagnoses, they get the pills, and end of story. The controversy surrounds the other 10 to 20% who do not get well, who continue to have lingering symptoms. And that is what we call chronic Lyme disease. It's rejected by the Infectious Diseases Society of America insofar as the contention that the Lyme spirochete continues to live, that you continue to be infected. So it's basically been kind of swept aside because it has become so controversial that doctors are afraid sometimes to diagnose Lyme disease early, but they certainly don't want to touch it later on when it gets advanced to its advanced stages.
So, this is what we're talking about right now is termed the Lyme Wars, and there's a little more to it as well of doctors not wanting to touch it. Can you just explain to us what actually has happened to some doctors that do treat chronic Lyme?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I began looking into Lyme disease in 2012, I had been an investigative reporter for many years. I had a long track record of looking into serious, heavy subjects of corruption and malfeasance and injustice in society and so forth. And I wanted to look into Lyme disease mainly because I knew that I could get my dog vaccinated for Lyme disease, but not myself. So that's kind of my starting point was look into why there's no vaccine. And I opened up a can of worms and found people who went to 5, 10, 15 doctors, could not get treatment for late-stage Lyme disease. And then I went to the doctors who were treating, the very, very few who were actually treating Lyme disease. And their protocols were more or less to give longer courses of antibiotics, though that was solely not the way they were treating patients. But by and large, they were treating with longer courses of antibiotics. And they were getting reported to the medical authorities in New York State, where I'm based. It's called the Office for Professional Medical Conduct. And in some cases, these doctors had been under investigation by the licensing authorities for years, 5, 6, 7 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on legal fees. Often the result would be that they were found to have had some record keeping, minor technical charges that were ultimately placed against them. But the reasons they were put through this ringer of professional investigation, of spending many, many dollars on legal fees, was because they were treating Lyme disease outside of the accepted medical protocols.
So, the thing that's baffling is the studies, I believe you said 80% recover if they're treated quickly. So then we have 20% who haven't recovered. And say if this was a strep infection, or say you had a UTI, it would be okay to treat with a longer course of antibiotics if the infection was still showing up in culture. So it's baffling to me that this infection can't be treated longer if it's still showing up.
Well, yes, it is quite baffling. I guess it probably goes back to, there have been a couple of 4 actually major clinical trials, meaning experiments in which they did give people with lingering Lyme symptoms longer courses of antibiotics, usually 3 months of antibiotics, part of it which was administered intravenously. The results of these trials were basically to find that it didn't cure the infection and they didn't see great improvement in the patients. In the last 2, the most recent trials in 2003 and in 2007, there was some improvement reported, but there was also some adverse events. So that largely wiped out the improvements. And by adverse events, I mean people had side effects of the treatment itself, usually infections from the intravenous administration. But those trials have been re-examined and critiqued in some scientific papers that I've read. And they were considered to have overestimated the adverse effects of the treatments. There's also a case to be made that intravenous administration of antibiotics and any other drug has vastly improved over the last decade. There are ways that we know that are better to do this, that avoid infection. The other problem with the trials is that they didn't consider that some of these patients may have also been infected by other things that are in the bellies of ticks that bite us. These are the infections that many Lyme specialists will treat along with Lyme disease. We know that the ticks that carry Lyme disease also may carry something called babesia, which can cause an illness that is similar to malaria. We know that they can carry Bartonella. Bartonellosis is a very serious infection with similar manifestations to Lyme disease, but equally difficult to eradicate in the human body once it gets a foothold. There's other things as well. So we have to know to look for these other illnesses, these other pathogens when we look for Lyme disease, and we need trials that address those as well. So the trials we had, yes, they say that longer courses didn't work, but they didn't consider that these other factors that we have to take into account.
Well, and these infections are treated differently. So if they're just treating Lyme and ignoring other infections, I would imagine that there would be a lot of symptoms that are left over or created even with the treatment. Yes,
there are other things that show up that will not be receptive, that will not respond to the antibiotics that we used for Lyme disease. Beyond that, though, we're also finding that the antibiotics, the common ones, doxycycline in particular, the ones that are used to treat acute or early stage Lyme disease may not be working. There's a wealth of scientific research coming out of some U.S. universities like Northeastern, like Johns Hopkins, Tulane, UC Davis. They basically have done such things as infect animals, namely mostly monkeys and mice, or take the pathogen in test tubes and then expose it to, classic doses of antibiotics that we use in people. And in many of these experiments, they're finding that something called persisters survive even after treatment. They are Lyme spirochetes that may take other forms, in particular a cyst form, a round body form it's called. And what's coming out of this research is a consensus that we're not killing the entire load of pathogens that you may have when you're infected. And this may very well explain those 10 to 20% who don't get better. It may explain a chronic form of the disease that continues to relapse, that these persisters stay behind. And it calls into question, frankly, our model of treating Lyme disease. That research is continuing to evolve to a point where researchers are now looking into other treatments, other ways that we might try to treat people for Lyme disease. We're a ways away from results from that research, but it's pointing in a direction that suggests what we're doing right now has flaws for at least a portion of the populace.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking today with Mary Beth Pfieffer, and we're discussing her book, Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change, and we'll be back shortly.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Take us on the go. It's even easier now. The Voice America Talk Radio Network has a mobile app for iOS, Android, or Amazon Kindle. Visit the Apple App Store, Amazon, or Google Play to download the app powered by Aircast. It's free and no registration is necessary. In minutes, you could be enjoying your favorite Voice America Talk Radio host no matter where you are, in the car, out and about, while traveling, or anytime you can't be close to your computer. Catch up on the archives you've missed or discover new shows on the spot. Search Voice America at your favorite app store.
Follow the Voice America Talk Radio Network on Twitter. We're at Voice America TRN. You'll get the latest fix on what's happening with our shows, this week's featured guests, and general happenings that you should know about at the Voice America Talk Radio Network. Now you don't have to miss anything when you're away from your home or office. Just go to twitter.com/Voice America TRN or follow along with us at Voice America TRN. The Voice America Talk Radio Network. We're on the cutting edge of social media. Can you keep up?
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we're talking with Mary Beth Pfieffer, and she is a journalist. Mary Beth, your book that we're talking about is called Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change. And I'm just wondering if you can explain to us why climate change is important for us to note in this whole scheme of Lyme disease.
Well, climate change didn't cause this Lyme disease epidemic that we have, but it most certainly is helping it and abetting it and moving it to many new frontiers. Canada, for one, is a new frontier for Lyme disease. I know it's been there in the southern portions in particular for a while, but it's now moving further and further north, as it is in Sweden and Norway and Russia, as it already has in the United States. And part of the reason for that is that it's getting warmer. We have evidence that ticks, for example, in the Czech Republic, in what is now the Czech Republic in 1958, couldn't go higher in the Alps than something like 800 meters. We now find them at 1,200 meters. That is sort of a microcosm of what is happening around the world. It's warmer on the top of that mountain than it was 50 years ago. It's warmer in Canada now than it was, several decades ago. We see this happening, this correlation between warmth and outbreaks and spread of tick-borne illness and ticks themselves. So I call my book The First Epidemic of Climate Change for this reason. We know that climate change is also pushing other diseases around and fostering other diseases. Things like yellow fever or plague, dengue fever, West Nile virus. There's a very long list. But what's different between those diseases and Lyme disease is that Lyme really exploded just as climate change was coming to the fore, just as it sort of reached that critical mass. We became aware of it in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it has continued really to, on the coattails of climate change, to really grow and blossom. It's also huge. So the fact that it's moving around, the fact that it's being driven by climate change, and the size of it is what makes me call it the first epidemic of climate change. It's in many other countries besides North America. It's in South America. It's emerging there. It's well established in Western Europe, and as I said, China, Russia, Australia even is having a problem with Lyme disease.
Well, in your book, you start talking about what's going to happen as our climate is changing, and it's going to be in my lifetime that this is everywhere, from what your book is saying, and that is terrifying. That and this is why I said everybody should read this, because we are all going to be affected by this if we haven't yet.
Yes, it's moving. These ticks are moving to more places than not. And what I mean by that is there is some potential that it'll get too hot for ticks in some places to survive. But they have not really validated or verified that has happened yet, that tick populations have contracted in some places. So, for example, I was in Arizona a couple of weeks ago. I mean, you think Arizona, you think desert and cactus and so forth, but they have Lyme disease, primarily in mountainous areas, in areas where there is a lot of green growth and so forth, and where it's a little bit more temperate, a little bit more humid. Ticks like humidity as much as they like warmth. So it's there where you would not expect it to be. I'm going out to Colorado next week. It's not generally accepted to be there by the medical community, but there is a fervent Lyme disease group out there that says, we have been infected, and we've been infected here where you don't think ticks and Lyme disease lives.
Well, I can believe that, because they're not far from where we are, and they have the same climate and the same altitude that we do in Calgary here. One thing you talk about in your book, which I think might be important for people to understand, is how the ticks are getting to where they're getting to. Like, are they crawling there, or what's actually happening?
Yes, that was a really fascinating study for my book. I have a chapter on birds and the role that birds, migrating birds in particular, play in this epidemic. And we have things called flyways, migratory flyways. And there's, for example, the Atlantic flyway, which goes from way South America all the way up through the eastern United States and up into Canada. We have the Pacific flyway. We have the Mississippi flyway. You get the idea. The birds come from way far south, and they may stop along the way. They may bring a tick from far south, or they may pick one up in the U.S., for example. They arrive in Canada to the places usually where they fledged, and they will drop ticks. Now, we know that birds have been doing this for very many years, thousands of years. They picked up ticks, the ticks dropped, and the ticks died in the places they were dropped. But today, they are surviving. They are thriving, in fact, and breeding. Beyond the role played by birds, and birds are also doing this in Europe. They're crossing, the North Sea. They can travel very far over water in order to drop ticks hither and yon. But beyond the role of birds, we also see in Canada mice are moving north. A different kind of mouse called the white-footed mouse is taking root in many places further north than it could formerly survive. So mice are also carrying it. Deer move it around, of course, to an extent. But birds are really the chief way that ticks are traveled long distances and find new homes and new happy places for them to live.
Well, and it does make sense. I mean, reading about that study, and it said that there was a prevalence of Lyme along those travel ways for the birds.
Yes, I read that one. That was an interesting study.
Yeah, and it when you think about it, it does make sense. So when doctors say we don't have it here, and it can't be, and then you look, well, these animals don't understand borders.
Yes,
they're not
exactly.
They're not looking at the border going, oh, we can't go there. They don't have any Lyme. They're just doing what they do, and we're turning a blind eye to it.
Yes, and that study, by the way, which I really loved, you find these sort of nuggets of information in the scientific literature that I just find fascinating. That was a study of reports of Lyme disease in dogs. So veterinarians had reported where dogs were infected, and a very astute researcher by the name of John Scott, he's Canadian, looked at the mapping of where infections occurred in dogs. And lo and behold, he found that they more or less mirrored the migratory flyway. So he made the connection between infection and the flyways. And he made it in dogs. And I'd also add that it's a lot easier to be diagnosed with Lyme disease if you are a dog, because the threshold, that two-tier test, is not what is counted or used, but rather it's an easier way to diagnose in dogs than it is in human beings.
Well, I always tell people that we should get the vets and the doctors together to talk about whether or not we have Lyme disease here and see what happens.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, because the vets will definitely say, we're reporting cases, the dogs have it, it's happening, and the doctors are saying it doesn't even exist, which is a little, obviously it has to if the dogs are having reported cases in the same province where the doctors are saying we don't have it.
And again, I think that goes back to the controversies that have swirled around Lyme disease. And on the testing, I would also just tell you one more discovery that I made in the scientific literature. I found basically that there were 30 papers in the literature about people who had been wrongly diagnosed with Lyme disease, about the overdiagnosis or false diagnosis of Lyme disease. I could only find 5 on underdiagnosis of Lyme disease, which we know is every bit as serious, I think more serious, a problem than overdiagnosis. If you are wrongly diagnosed with Lyme disease, and it does happen, you may be given a short course of antibiotics and you'll be on your way. This is among the safest drugs that are out there. They shouldn't be abused, they shouldn't be overused, but they are safe drugs. But if your diagnosis is missed and you aren't treated, you can go on to a very long siege of disability, of pain, of not being able to go to work, of not being able to get out of bed in the morning. And moreover, your search for care will be much more complicated because, as you say, doctors don't recognize it where you are. And moreover, doctors haven't been given the tools to treat late-stage Lyme disease. They don't know what to do when a late-stage Lyme case presents. They give antibiotics, yes, but they give short courses, and basically the person is told, well, you have to go to a rheumatologist, or you have to go to a psychiatrist, or you have to go to another doctor. I really can't treat you. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a common story. It's part of mine, and I think anybody else with chronic Lyme. And I personally would have welcomed, a short course of antibiotics over the years of suffering that I had. So often doctors, it seems they say, okay, we're going to wait and see if you have symptoms after a bite, and which I think is more dangerous, as you're saying, to wait than to just go, okay, you've been bitten, here's some antibiotics, won't cause any harm.
And that's the one thing that patients can do, is to advocate for themselves and say, I know that ticks are out there. I may or may not have been bitten, but I have some symptoms. I want to be treated. And here in the U.S., doctors do respond to that sort of thing. I'm not sure it's as clear-cut in Canada. But patients need to advocate for themselves on this disease.
Yeah, definitely they do. Now, I'm sure that people that are listening are getting a little worried about what they can do to protect themselves and their family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say that government has not done enough, and healthcare officials have not done enough to protect us against this epidemic. basically the whole approach to it has been, okay, we'll put signs at walking trails, hiking trails. We'll make announcements that it's tick season and you need to check yourself. This is all well and good, and this is stuff that needs to get out there, even to a greater extent than it's out there now. But we can do some things to protect ourselves. I write in my book about clothing on which you can spray or you can buy clothing that is already treated with something called permethrin. It's a substance, a synthetic form of something that is in chrysanthemum flowers. And it is a very effective deterrent to ticks. Ticks do not like clothing that is impregnated or treated with permethrin. So I spent a couple hours last weekend spraying our sneakers, the whole family, my grandkids, my husband, us, sneakers, socks, and some of our pants with this substance. It doesn't wash out immediately. It can, pants and socks, for example, can be worn up to 6 times or laundered up to 6 times before you have to retreat them. And it's been shown to be safe and very effective. I read the studies on safety. I was convinced that it is safe for children. So I would highly recommend that. Beyond this, you have to stay away from places where ticks hang out. Tall grasses. Don't brush up against the grasses and brush that line a walking trail, for example. Do check yourself when you come in to make sure you don't have any ticks on you. If you've been walking through an area where you think you might have picked up ticks, throw your clothes in the dryer for 15 minutes. That will kill them. There's also, sprays that are on the market for properties. They do work to keep down the population of ticks. I myself am not a fan of spraying chemicals on my property. I would rather get rid of the brush, get rid of the leaves that ticks like to hide in, keep places sunny and open. Ticks don't like sun because they dry out. So there are things we can do.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I encourage anybody to pick up your book. Can you just let us know where that's located or how people can get a hold of you if they have any questions?
Okay, well, the book, first of all, can be easily found on Amazon. It's there with a lot of reviews and good ones, I might add. I have a website called thefirstepidemic.com, and you can find my email there. I encourage people to contact me with comments and questions.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a great, informative show.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And I want to thank everybody for listening today. Today we're talking with Mary Beth Pfieffer, and her book was Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change. So thank you so much for listening, and be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We'll talk more next week.